Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And last month when I covered Slum Village on this show, I made sure to highlight how much that project was a springboard for legendary producer Jay Dilla, who had started to pick up some traction in a few years before, but really launched into major cult prominence off of that album. And while that success would continue to cascade down somewhat into the other members of Slum Village, both present and future, today we're going to be exploring a similar launch point in underground hip-hop, but one that time might have forgotten if you didn't know where to look. So, 1997 in Cincinnati, a city which has never really been a hotbed of hip-hop in any era, but things are moving for an up-and-coming group called 3 Below Zero, featuring rappers Mainflow and Dante and producer Jossin. More to the point, they've got a connection to future big-name producer Hi-Tek, who hit it up well with an up-and-coming Brooklyn MC that you might have heard of called Talib Kweli, who we already covered on an earlier episode of the show. Now, they had released a couple singles over the past couple of years, and the one that tends to be recognized the most is 1996's Hustle on the Side, which, for the record, is a pretty terrific forgotten gem in its own right. But they had changed their name, and they had ventured up to New York City to record their debut album, which would be released in 1997. And you know what? Depending on who you talk to, it's either mostly known as the launch pad for Talib Kweli and Hi-Tek, or as a forgotten underground classic in its own right, inspiring dozens if not hundreds of acts. And it would take until this group as a whole until 2011 to release a non-compilation follow-up. So alright, here we go. Let's get into Doom, the debut album from Mood, and this is Resonators. So you know what, I'll admit right now that this is the sort of project I was dreading a little bit. Not because the album is bad in the slightest. In fact, I argue it's pretty damn good and generally feels more consistently likable than the last album I even covered here. But it is exactly the sort of album that has been outshone by the stars it introduced onto the scene. Because otherwise, it feels like the sort of pretty good underground hip-hop release that would have dropped and would have been celebrated in 1997, but 20 years later, it just doesn't seem as revolutionary or special outside of that moment because dozens, if not hundreds of MCs will have flooded the market with very similar product. Don't get me wrong, it would have been great at the time, but going back to it now, it's just not all that unique. And you know what, even then, going back to Doom, I have to wonder what would have made this album stand out beyond being a launch pad. Because if you're looking at the conventional tones of the underground at the time, Doom is not that far afield. The dusty boom-bap drums with passing glances at A Tribe Called Quest, but not enough to pick up the more intricate groove sections and the taste for melody. You get some spare samples that are nestled about halfway into the mix, but rarely driving it compared to the low end, and more than a few glowing glances at similar acts like Jedi Mind Tricks and a few of the Wu-Tang affiliates. And of course, it runs long with less than zero interest in anything close to a single. And if from that description you feel like you've already heard this album a half dozen times, okay, there's a limit to how much I will hold that against Mood, given how it probably wasn't the norm at the time, but it certainly doesn't help many of these cuts stand out that much now. Now, to Mood's credit, they did have a few considerable advantages on this album. The first being some consistent production. Yeah, a few vocal pickups might feel a little bit tinny, but outside of the melodies being consistently a little quieter and less interesting than the beats and grooves themselves, they never sounded poorly blended or out of place, and there is a real consistency in the gritty knock of the percussion and the smart vocal blending that can make a longer listen like this rather tolerable. And now it does mean that a lot of the production can feel a little monochromatic and lacking a lot of distinctive flair. We'll come back to this. But you also don't get the blaring moments of outright annoyance or missteps that could compromise projects in the indie scene like this. Now, granted, if you pay attention, you can tell that Hi-Tek has a slightly better grasp on the blending than Jossin does, with a few unwelcome peaks creeping across a few cuts like Peace Infinity, but that's me nitpicking, and I will say Jossin's a little bit more willing to focus on a brighter hook or a more propulsive groove, such as Peddlers of Doom, or the slight Middle Eastern touch on the melody of Secrets of the Sand, which has one of the better or more distinctive hooks here, or even sneaking that touch of horns onto Esoteric Manuscripts, and the thunderclaps splitting across the subtle groove of Sacred Part 1. That being said, Hi-Tek does sneak in a sharper hook on Illuminated Sunlight, bringing a lot of scratching off the piano and the bass on Info for the Streets, slides the piano and the faint vocal sample for the actual single Karma, which is one of the better songs here, brings up a scratchy funk sample with some good bass frolic on Industry Lies. Again, you can see a lot of the potential that he brought to bear. But as I said, you're more here to sink into the ambience, the menace, the ethereal danger coasting off the gritty grooves and the bars upon bars upon bars, with any moment where Talib steps up as a clear sign of a young, self-assured, unique talent that had buckets of potential. But outside of slightly more wild and colorful delivery from Wu affiliate Sons of Man, most of the focus eventually will switch back to the main MCs, Mainflow and Dante, with Mainflow stepping up with a little bit more aggressive swagger and Dante a shade bit more high-pitched and nasal, and kind of almost reminiscent of Q-Tip at points given some of his flow. And here's the frustrating thing. In terms of consistent multisyllabic rhyming and technical skill, getting the bars to line up, both these two are really damn solid, and they got the aggression to hold their own. By any standard, they are really good MCs, and I do appreciate that they're not really treading in the same territory as Jedi Mind Tricks, as there's a sharper, conscious, and slightly more grounded angle that does permeate the content beyond the pseudo-religious abstraction. But the most scathing indictment of these guys is that they're kind of boring. Ultra competent, but not all that interesting in their content. And look, I was coming into this review looking to refute that assertion, but I can definitely hear a lack of distinctive individual personality between these two outside of their voices to make their verses stand out from each other and hold up today, especially given as they don't really have a ton of interplay. I mean, let me ask this question. Off this album alone, name a personal detail or note of challenging introspection that either Dante or Mainflow present. You know what, in fact, I'll go one further. Name something in their lyrical style or structure or content that is unique to one of them, but not the other. I mean, the closing track highlights them repping for Cincinnati, but even that is not all that specific or detail outside of all their consistent quasi-esoteric brand of paranoia, a deeper grounding in more religious text, and a hatred of a broken system. I mean, guest star Home Skillet probably does the most, and even then, it's not really a lot there to end off the project. And that's also not to excuse the moments that are sadly less excusable, but kind of expected for this brand of underground hip-hop. Because not only do we get the homophobia and Tunnel Bound, a shame because off the juxtaposition of swearing off Satan and then faced with a corrupt system in the verses, that is a potent juxtaposition and it comes together well. Then we get lines from Dante on Sacred Part 1 talking about vaccines giving black kids AIDS. Seriously. Now, try to give him some form of credit or explanation. The scene is at least prefaced with Dante talking about false and corrupt preachers who are selling lines and then blaming tragedies on others. But the correlation's still being made, and it's kind of jarring when you have Talib deliver his monologue on the back half of Peddlers of Doom that's actually progressive and forward-thinking, and it's probably one of my favorite songs here. And that's the exasperating thing. I mean, you step away from that issue, and now they run into the Jedi Mind Tricks problem of a lot of esoteric references and language feeling kind of exotic but strangely hollow without more of a grounded human connection. And even then they do try, but it doesn't always stick the landing or feel distinct or unique. My only larger issue is how some of these verses can start to run together in terms of their detail and content. But even then, that's a lesser factor once you start picking up on some of the details. And in the end, I can't deny it's a good listen, and on flows and good production alone, I would argue this holds up. I see why it's been influential. Again, there are flaws, and like most projects of this era and sound, it can absolutely drag, and it doesn't remotely surprise me that Mood only got one complete project off before Mainflow went solo across the 2000s, and the group only reunited to release new music to mixed reviews in the 2010s. But you know what? I see the album's influence. While I have heard dozens of projects like it, it would fit into the upper tier of that group regardless, which is why I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 and a recommendation as a mostly forgotten gem from this era. It might be best known as an introduction, but you know what, in terms of setting up that vibe, Mood, they live up to their name. So yeah, if you get the chance, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'll admit I didn't have a ton to say about this album. In terms of themes, it's a little scattershot, and again, it runs long. There's just not much to it that I haven't heard before, but again, it's good stuff in terms of delivering what I have heard before. So if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I am curious where people fall on this as one of the more underground, forgotten projects. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you're looking for new episodes of Billboard Breakdown, they're on the new channel right over there. But hey, until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Resonators on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.